Right, okay, so here's what he says. The God image feels obliged to move closer to humankind, so closer to the ego. So it's coming up out of the depths of the deep unconscious, so some or all can see it. Okay, so I think that's what you're talking about.
Which is ego. Yeah.
Pardon? So it's coming.
So all can see it. This means it.
Yeah. So when it's constellated, it starts to move. Okay, and this is what they were saying, that the encounter caused the constellation of the God image to begin in humanity about 3,500 years ago, 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, everywhere, okay? Because all these things were going on within a 500-year period, plus or minus, or let's say within a 1,500-year period, which is nothing within the history of humanity. So within the history of humanity, at this period, about 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, something happened. It may not have been to Job, but it happened to somebody that caused this God image to begin to move toward humanity, which meant toward the ego, right?
Yeah, and you also, if you think about it astrologically, you could say that was the end of the period of the age of Aries.
Right.
And maybe there was something going on where there was this sense of assertion was going on. Maybe there were lots of wars. Maybe, but whatever it was, they were activated and moving in a way where they had to assert themselves, and thereby began the schism, the split, where they pulled themselves out of the unconscious because they had to fight wars or something.
Right. I mean,
that would be
do you at all remember? Do either of you remember what the time of David was, and Solomon and David and those guys? Oh, well, I know what it is, because it's. See, it's the same time. It's the same time, because the Babylonian captivity was something like 550 BC, and according to Jewish tradition, the Babylonian captivity was because David screwed Uriah's wife and had him killed. Right? Pardon?
I said those women get you in more trouble.
You would be happy the rest of your life making a husband.
Right. Okay, so it turns out.
Happy, the ugly woman.
So it turns out, I'm going to cut to the chase for a minute, because it turns out that what is emerging during this whole period is righteousness. Okay, righteousness. Okay, as the primary virtue. Now we're going to get to that.
Is that the law?
No, it's. I think it's conscience. I have it, but you don't. From right here, it says, when righteousness became the prime virtue. Okay, from that on isn't in your copy. However, it is in the Dropbox, okay? So if you pull down the Dropbox copy, you can print it out. But what I did, because I've been doing these things parallel, when I've been reading Answer to Job, I've been outlining it for the video, for the commentary under the video. And since I'm doing that already, I just, for 677 to 687, I just cut and paste from that onto this. But I did that at 6:30 tonight. So you didn't make the cut. So the point is that at the time of Job, this archetype, which is at the deepest level of human consciousness, okay, basically at the pleroma level, starts to move. Something starts to happen, okay? Jung attributes it to whatever happened to Job, but nobody really knows what happened to Job, and nobody really knows what happened before Job, and the book of Job didn't get written until 1,000 years later. So what we know from the book of Job is only what had come into the mind of the storytellers. Like one of the things that Jung says in Memories, Dreams, Reflections is, what would these old storytellers have to say about Hiroshima? Good question,
Just got a picture of a dragon. I mean, they're sold there.
Yeah, and I mean, and 1,000 years from now, what are the, if we were somehow cut off from modern life because of Hiroshima or because of a thermonuclear war, let's say, yeah. If the world ended except for pockets of human beings around the world, then 1,000 years from now, how would the storytellers be describing it? Let's assume that you lose.
A trickster came onto the earth.
I mean, good question. I mean, let's suppose that we lost all our power grids and no longer had electricity, or at least widespread, and we lost the internet and everything.
I think it would start out literal, and then it would begin to
turn into myths.
Yeah, it would. You would start out with, let's say you see an atomic explosion, there's a great fire, and then there's fallout, and the air turns to poison. I mean, that could, depending on, some people have dragons and stuff, but whatever it is that generates incredible fire. The sun came to the earth, and the air was burned, and it killed everyone. Something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, well, that could be a novel. What the heck, Just,
Burns is very popular for a reason.
yeah, put yourself 1,000 years.
Stone Age, a bunch of people.
Yeah. Picture yourself 1,000 years in the future, and we've been cut off from electricity and.
They say that would take us back to basically Stone Age level.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, you gotta wonder if we haven't already done that, and we're the recovering from it.
Yeah, the final part of the basic idea then is the God image feels obliged to move closer to humankind, which is what you're saying. What he means by that is to get noticed by consciousness, which is the ego, right? And that's caused by something that happens in the deep unconscious that causes that.
now, is that a trigger? Is it some kind of a psychic?
Well, they call it
seismic event?
constellation, but it's some sort of trigger that calls for the God image to start to emerge, right? Before that, primitives had a very different attitude about God and God image. And remember what they were saying before about the new God image was that we all come through these stages. We tend to want to be communal. We like to stick together in groups, right? But the trouble is the groups can get out of whack. Like Nazi Germany got pretty out of whack. Yeah, and the same thing happened in the Soviet Union, and in order for that to be stopped, it takes individuals to step up and say, this ain't good. Okay, all right, so, but anyway, the point that Edinger and Jung are making is that the God image is the most basic archetype, the deepest layer. The basic objective of the psyche overall is to fulfill this constellated archetype. And so even if you're an atheist, you can call it there's no God, but the opposite of there's no God is there is a God, right? And no? Okay. Sorry.
Oh yeah, nice one.
All right.
Well, okay, that's dualistic thinking, sure. If you're not doing that, then
Well, if you're not doing that, you're
you're an artist.
a snail. No, you're not an artist. Artists have psychic energy, but
Just have duality.
You know, one thing though you were talking about. Remember, I talked about the one fitting into the other.
Right.
And you're talking about how this part changed over the millennium. You know, so that means that interface changed between the two, which means the God image changed to accommodate each. change.
precisely. And so if we look at paragraph 617, well, okay, it's talking about there must be some dire necessity responsible for Yahweh to remember Sophia. Things simply couldn't go on as before, okay, because Sophia was in the pleroma, right? And the just God could not go on committing injustices, and the omniscient could not behave any longer like a clueless and thoughtless human being. Self-reflection becomes an imperative necessity, and for this wisdom is needed. Yahweh has to remember his absolute knowledge, for if Job gains knowledge of God, then God must also learn to know himself. It just could not be that Yahweh's dual nature should become public property and remain hidden from himself alone. Here's the quote I'm looking for. Whoever knows God has an effect on him. The failure of the attempt to corrupt Job has changed Yahweh's nature. Okay. So because Job has seen through God, basically seen through God's jazz, right? Because he has seen through God, God is going to have to change, and so that's what causes Sophia to be constellated again and remind Yahweh that, oh yeah, I have a feminine side too, right? And maybe there ought to be some righteousness in the process here. So I think of it as conscience, isn't it? Conscience. And so in nature, there are no qualms, but in humanity, at some point in our evolution, we started to have qualms, which is a conscience, right? That's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's not a function it's generated by our social structure, by our need to be socially engaged with one another.
Right.
I think I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but isn't it? Well, I don't know about ants, but apes and monkeys, will have a conscience. They might.
Yeah, they have a rudimentary conscience, yeah. But they're not conscious of their conscience. That's the difference. Okay.
It's more like a reactionary rather than
Right. I mean, it's a behavior. It's a group behavior or whatever, right?
I can teach my cat to feel guilty if he does something.
Pardon?
I can teach my cat to feel guilty, like, that.
Right.
Full moon and a cat sometimes don't mix. And I say, look what you did. And he does feel guilt because he'll come and he stops up and he understands that he's done something wrong.
Right.
But he's still probably looking out for his instinct, which is he wants to eat tomorrow morning. So.
Right.
So that's it. It's almost like you're leading up to the thing that it's conscience was something that emerges like an archetype, and I don't think it does.
You don't think what?
I don't think it emerges because it's an archetype.
Do you think it's an evolution?
I think it's like a ritual. It's like a social construction. It's like a.
Well, I'm not saying it's an archetype. I'm saying that from the archetype, righteousness emerged about this time. Okay. Pardon?
Which archetype did it emerge?
Well, from the God image, went along for millions of years, presumably, and then Job came along and said, "Aha, Yahweh, I see you have two sides." Right? And so, therefore, Yahweh had to change in terms of...
Softening? Is that where the softening
Yeah.
came?
I mean, there was a disturbance in the unconscious, right? And that disturbance also called up Sophia, right? Because there was a feminine side since the beginning also. And so all those things as Jung puts it later, there was a disturbance in the collective unconscious.
And that's how we move more from thought to more feeling. Because you said that the child sacrificing stopped, so that's just...
Right, and that was about the same time as Job, a little before, when Abraham stopped sacrificing. But mind you, Abraham stopped Jews sacrificing around 1700 BC, and they're still doing it in the Yucatan 2,000 years later.